when it comes to the police department and what it's doing in the public's name and also how it's spending public dollars. We all benefit when we understand what the police department is doing, and that helps inform conversations about any potential reforms that might be pending. And again, that's not just at the municipal level, it's at the state house level right now. That impacts the entire Commonwealth.
I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. A quick reminder, on September 25th, I'll be moderating a panel discussion about COVID-19 and open government. I'll be joined by a number of journalists, health experts, and media law attorneys. We'll be discussing the best ways to get information about the coronavirus and how government is responding. Please join us. Go to nfoic.org for more information on how to register. It's all part of the National Freedom of Information Coalition's 2020 Open Government Summit. You can also subscribe at nfac.org to get updates on all of our upcoming events and presentations. I'm here today with Jessie Rossman, who's the staff attorney at the ACLU Foundation of Massachusetts. Jessie, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
Now, Jessie and her colleagues have recently filed suit against the city of Boston, the Boston Police Department, over unfulfilled public record requests that would shed light on the use of force within Boston Police Department and give us a lot of much needed transparency within the law enforcement agency. I invited Jessie on here today because I think this lawsuit hits on two of our primary concerns, the first being police accountability and transparency, but also the Massachusetts Public Records Law, which was reformed in 2016, but could still use a lot of improvement. So, Jessie, if you wouldn't mind, could you please start us off by giving us a little bit of background into the lawsuit and tell us about the circumstances that existed prior to filing this case?
Absolutely. As we know, transparency is really at the heart of accountability. And the public has a right to know what the police are doing with their tax dollars and in their name. And that's all the more true right now. It's become even more urgent as the conversations surrounding police violence and the legislative and city ordinance efforts towards police reform have become particularly urgent in the past couple of months. So, in light of that, there's a lot of information that really needs to form the basis of any kind of informed conversation that we're having in the public right now. And that involves information about how the police department has used force in the past, how the police department has responded to recent demonstrations. We've seen demonstrations throughout the country, and right here in Massachusetts, in the city of Boston, they occurred both in May and June, and more recently as well. So, to inform the conversations that are happening at cities like Boston, which right now has a pending ordinance with respect to tear gas usage, as well as the state legislature right now, which we know is considering an omnibus police reform bill. Both organizations and individuals have been submitting public records requests in order to get information about how the police departments are operating. And both ourselves and the individual client that we're representing over the course of the past 17 months had submitted 9 public records requests, including a suite of public records requests in June that were focused on the demonstrations that had happened in May and June, and were met repeatedly with silence or sometimes continued promises for updates about status reports. What we didn't receive were the documents, and particularly given the urgency of now, we felt that it was extraordinarily important to make sure the public gets access to this information as quickly as possible.
So, can you describe for me a little bit more about that information? What specific records were you requesting, and what kind of information do you hope to get from those records?
There are a couple of different categories. So both the ACLU and the individual requester had submitted separate requests looking for documents with respect to the Boston Police Department's use of force during the May and June demonstrations. And the ACLU also submitted a separate request to contextualize the reported use of chemical weapons during the May and June demonstrations, looking for any documentation from the BPD about its previous use of chemical weapons up to 2016. Additionally, both the ACLU and the individual requester had submitted separate requests that were looking at Potential communications between local law enforcement officials and federal law enforcement officials, of course. That's something else that we know has been very much in the news lately. And the ACLU had submitted requests looking at any potential communications between the city and federal agencies from May 24th onward. And the individual requester had also requested information with respect to any communications between the Boston Police Department surrounding the Department of Justice and Bill Barr coming to visit the BPD in June. In addition to that, those were the most recent requests that had been submitted. There were also a series of requests that had been pending for quite some time, which I think really underscores the fact that these were not isolated occurrences. And they also aren't occurrences that can simply be blamed on the pandemic. There have been requests that have been pending since September and March of 2019, again, looking at the use of force from the Boston Police Department during the so-called Straight Pride Parade that occurred last summer, as well as the location of surveillance cameras in Boston.
So I know you began the conversation by telling us about the importance of transparency, and I appreciate that. But there might be some listening to this interview right now that don't have any interaction with the Boston police, may not even spend much time in Boston, and are thinking, well, what does this have to do with me? Why should this information be out there? Why are we hassling the police to get these records? What would you say to them? Why is it relevant to those that may not have a direct connection to either protests or ongoing demonstrations involving the police force?
Well, I think we all can agree that when it comes to the police department and what it's doing in the public's name and also how it's spending public dollars, we all benefit when we understand what the police department is doing, and that helps inform conversations about any potential reforms that might be pending. And again, that's not just at the municipal level, it's at the state house level right now. That impacts the entire Commonwealth. But I also think it goes to a core question about the application of the public records law here in the Commonwealth. And as you had mentioned earlier, we had a series of amendments in 2016. And those amendments were incredibly important because prior to that time, the Commonwealth really was at the bottom of the heap when it came to transparency and the ability to provide public records to those who were living in the Commonwealth. And in fact, in 2015, we got a failing grade from the Center of Public Integrity for lack of transparency with respect to public records. And it was really on the heels of that and the groundswell of support that came from the public and the media and legislature that we passed those amendments in 2016, which Governor Baker called a new way of doing business in the Commonwealth. And I think that's really important, and it involved a series of amendments that were designed to ensure that there was increased communication between individuals who were requesting documents and the agencies that were receiving those requests, and also ensuring that there were actual enforceable timelines to make sure that people got the information in a timely manner. We know that, justice deferred is justice denied. The same is true when it comes to transparency in public records. There's a timeliness that's incredibly important. And those new amendments make clear that those timelines are not suggestions. They're the law. It's important to enforce them.
Absolutely. And I remember in 2016, ACLU, NEFAC, a number of other transparency advocates, we worked extremely hard to get those reform measures passed. And we're very excited that they did pass. But as we can see here with your lawsuit, still a lot of room to improve, whereas Massachusetts may have been at the bottom of the heap as far as their public records law is concerned. Maybe we're, at the middle now, or something just shy of mediocre as far as the law is concerned. What kind of improvements do we still need to the public records law that would make sure that we get information when we need it from those agencies that, like the Boston Police Department, that are wielding a tremendous amount of power against citizens and need more transparency? What can we do?
Well, I think what's important is that a lot of those provisions are actually in place right now, and now it comes to actual enforcement. So I think the critical piece is when you look at those amendments that came out in 2016 with respect to increased transparency, included those timelines. So, for example, municipalities need to respond within 10 business days, either with the documents or with a written response, which lays out very clearly what documents they're going to produce, what documents they're going to withhold, and why, any potential modifications, as well as if they are requesting additional time, that can only go up to 25 business days. And then under the 10C provision, there is an additional ability for them to petition the supervisor for up to 30 business days. But again, that is only on the basis of good cause, which is defined statutorily to include various different factors that have to be analyzed, including efforts that they've undertaken to produce the document so far. So there's actually a lot of those mechanisms, both the timelines and what they need to do in order to request any kind of additional time under that time frame that's in place. It's really the accountability and making sure that all public agencies actually abide by those requirements. And that's really what this lawsuit is about, is actually enforcing the provisions that the legislature worked so hard to put into place to make sure that the municipalities are actually abiding by it.
So, what are the next steps as far as the lawsuit's concerned? Tell us, what the process is. What's going to happen now?
At this point, we're waiting for responsive pleadings from the defendants, and we anticipate that that will be sometime in October, and we're going to continue apace from there.
Excellent. And lastly, before we wrap up here, when it comes to public records, something that I'm often finding myself explaining is that the public records transparency, it's not just the issue for journalists or for activists or even for matters related to the police, right? Public records and transparency, it's an issue for every citizen in the state to make sure that they understand how government is operating and that government is in fact operating in the public's interests. Do you have any suggestions for all citizens on how to take advantage of the public records law and make sure that their agencies, whether it's the Boston Police Department or whether it's a local school board, whatever level of government we're talking about, making sure that they're acting transparently and giving the communities the information they need? What would you suggest to them?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, the government interacts with us on a day-to-day basis, and as you just mentioned, it's a number of different ways. Obviously, the police departments are one, but everything from public health to education to environmental control, those are all things that we're interacting with on a regular basis. The public records law makes clear sort of the steps to reach out to records access officer, which each municipality is meant to have to get those documents. And I think, again, what's important is that it does create a mechanism to have conversations with the record access officer. But if the documents are public, you're a member of the public. You have a right to have access to them. And the public records law is as good as the public who is taking that opportunity provided to them to get access to those documents. So I certainly encourage people to make sure that they're working with their government and finding out what the government's doing in their name.
Great, thank you. And where can we find more information about the ACLU's lawsuit and all the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thanks for asking. We have a website and there is a case page. If you go to aclum.org and you look under our cases tab, you'll see there's a case page for all of the cases that we brought, including this one.
Excellent. Jesse, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate your help going through these issues and helping us understand a little bit more about the transparency issues within the Boston Police Department.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.